These Game Boy macro faceplates made by Retro Game Restore and currently available from ZedLabz are a dream come true for DS Lite modders. They let you take apart a broken DS Lite and repurpose it into a fully functional Game Boy Advance console with a front-facing speaker and a neat solution for the power LED that's traditionally housed in the DS Lite's hinge bracket. The kit comes with a high-quality injection molded faceplate available in a range of 3 different translucent colours, together with the resistor needed to convert the motherboard, and a tiny speaker that fits neatly in a purpose-made recess next to the screen. The rest of the parts you'll need can be salvaged from your DS Lite console, so it's a low-cost way to take abandoned hardware and repurpose it into something pretty awesome. Hi and welcome back to the shed. I'm Joe Bleeps and this is a Game Boy macro made from the remnants of a faulty DS Lite and this great little faceplate kit available from ZedLabz. Right, now I normally leave this stuff until the end of the video, but if you want to get your hands on one of these kits before they sell out again, please consider using the ZedLabz affiliate link I've left in the description and get yourself some money off by using the code JoeBleeps at the checkout. If you use my links, I'll get a small commission from each sale and you'll be helping support the channel at no extra cost to you. Now back to the video. If you ever find yourself in possession of a broken or faulty Nintendo DS Lite, you might want to consider turning it into what's becoming commonly known as a Game Boy macro. With the DS Lite's native ability to run Game Boy Advance cartridges, it's the perfect candidate for a single screen conversion, having a form factor very similar to the original Game Boy Advance, but with a built-in backlit screen. Traditionally, the downside to the process of building a macro is the fact that the faceplate has the remnants of the hinge still visible at the top, so you can either have the option to do a lot of cutting, filling, smoothing and painting to remove those hinge sections, or find a workaround like I did with my Neon Advance and my Macro Cube consoles. I made a video on that one and I'll try and remember to link it up here for you. In any case, I've always said that what we need is a high quality, commercially available faceplate designed specifically for this very purpose. And it just so happens that my prayers have been answered. That is exactly what we're going to be looking at in this video. An injection molded faceplate with all the bits you need to create your own Game Boy macro from a broken DS Lite, with no cutting, filling, painting or modification of the shell needed. But is it really that easy? Let's take a look. Okay, so in the kit you'll get the faceplate itself in either frosted clear black or atomic purple. In addition to that, you'll get the tiny 330 ohm resistor needed to trick the DS motherboard into thinking the top screen is still attached, and a tiny speaker that fits in a small recess on the faceplate. From your DS Lite console, you'll need to salvage the motherboard, the rear shell and the buttons, ideally all working and in good shape. That said, if you have a fully working DS Lite, I strongly advise you please leave it as it is. Find yourself a better suited donor console. The DS Lite is a design masterpiece and I hate the thought of one being destroyed to make one of these. These are cool, but don't destroy a perfectly good console. There are plenty of faulty units out there that you can use instead. Just keep hunting. If the DS cartridge slot 1 is working, then this is a nice bonus, as there is the scope to run emulators and a small number of DS games on the single screen. But the real reason for building this is the Game Boy Advance functionality, so you'll need to be sure slot 2 is in full working order. It doesn't actually matter how scratched up the lower screen is, because you'll actually be removing the touchscreen layer to uncover a pristine, vibrant TFT LCD hidden underneath. If you've got a number of broken DS Lite consoles, you can even mix and match to get a contrast of colours, or salvage the parts that are in the best condition to go towards your final creation. In terms of tools, there is soldering involved, so you'll need a soldering iron, ideally a low wattage one with a fine tip, some solder, a length of thin wire, and if you have some flux, that will make everything easier too. In terms of tools, a small tri-wing screwdriver and a small Phillips screwdriver are needed, and a spudger and a pair of tweezers will be very useful as well. I also used my magnetic PCB holder to secure the motherboard in place while I was soldering. So with that all out of the way, let's start the process. First up, the DS Lite. Now my console here was the perfect kind of donor you need for this sort of project. A scratched up touchscreen, a ding out of the faceplate, a faulty top screen and a wobbly hinge with a bit of a crack in the plastic. However, in terms of the parts I needed, the buttons all worked, charging, power and sound were fine, well, after I'd replaced the charging socket, which you can see in another video, and the rear shell was actually all in fairly great shape. Before disassembling the DS Lite, I decided I should inspect my macro kit first. It's all contained in the new plastic-free packaging from ZedLabz. It's really good to see them moving forwards in this direction, and there's a satisfying tactile quality to the packaging when you're opening things up, and I definitely prefer it to their older packaging. Also, you don't need to use scissors, which is great. There's the resistor and the speaker in a separate bag, and then there's the faceplate itself. Taking a close look at it, the quality is great with no visible imperfections and an even slightly textured top surface. Unlike 3D printed parts that are common nowadays, the precision of this piece really stands out. In addition to all this, I had some tiny 2mm diameter, 1mm thick magnets, because on my previous build I found the holes for the pins on the L and R triggers were a little bit deep, so the pins went right in and didn't engage in the rear shell holes. These magnets slightly extend the pins for a much better fit. To take apart your DS Lite, remove the dust cover on port 2, use a Phillips screwdriver to undo the battery cover and remove that first. You might need to use the flat end of a spudger to help remove the cover and the battery, and then use the pointed end to help remove the two little rubber feet. After that, you have a small Phillips screw in the battery compartment, two gold ones underneath where the feet were, 3 tri-wing screws on the upper left and the lower left and right corners, and a shorter tri-wing screw just inside slot 1. Next, hold the shell open near one of the triggers and use the spudger to disengage any plastic clips. Run it along the outside edge as you gently hold it open and you'll feel it pop apart. You can now remove the rear shell and inspect it to see if it's usable and if it needs any cleaning. Then remove the L and R buttons. Try and keep the spring and the pins in place, but don't worry if they come apart. There are 2 Phillips screws holding the motherboard in place. Remove these and then open the console hinge slightly just so you can get your fingers onto the screen and lift it out. Undo the clip on the bracket holding the top screen's ribbon in place, then use a spudger to unclip the black and white wires. Remove the Wi-Fi board. This contains the BIOS for the DS Lite, so it is very important not to lose that and to make sure it goes back in when you're putting it back together. You then need to feed the black wire out from under slot 1. It's a bit fiddly, but tweezers or a spudger can help make it easier. Just be patient. Remove the silicone pads and the buttons, and then you can put the rest of the console to one side. Next job is to remove the lower screen. Take out the digitizer ribbon by unclipping the catch with your spudger, and then remove the main ribbon on the front in the same way you detach to your top screen. Now that the motherboard is all clear, it's time to solder the resistor in place between the LED A2 and LED C2 solder points on the motherboard. It's a surface mount resistor which is tiny and can seem a bit intimidating, but it's not actually too difficult. With the motherboard secured in place on my PCB holder, I put flux on each pad, and then you just need to add solder to one of the pads first, like I did here with LED A2. I did almost put some on the other pad, but I realized before it was too late. With these resistors, they are so small, they are easy to lose. So once it's out of the packaging, do keep a close eye on it. Lay it on the board and put it in position near the solder that you've applied. Use tweezers to hold it, heat the solder and push the resistor gently in place towards LED A2, making sure it's centered between the 2 points on the board. Then you can turn the board around and solder the other end by heating the pad and resistor and adding a little solder, after which you can add a little bit more to LED A2 if you need it. For the speaker, you need to add flux and solder to the speaker point marked SPLO and also to the tiny point at the top just to the right of where it says 44. You can use the audio ground point on the headphone socket, but that's quite far away and it requires a little bit of tricky wire routing. I did some continuity testing and I actually found that the small point next to the number 44 by the bracket for the top screen ribbon serves the same purpose and gives a solder point in a much more convenient spot. It is harder to solder to because it's so small, but I feel it is worth it for the benefit of having such a short wire. So that's the motherboard all prepared. Now for the screen. So the faceplate is designed to work with just the screen and not the digitizer. This means we lose touchscreen functionality, but it uncovers a pristine, vibrant display that looks fantastic with Game Boy Advance games. Separating the layers isn't too bad, as the digitizer layer is plastic and it will flex a little bit. Hold the metal frame of the screen in one hand, pull the digitizer away from the corner and let it gradually detach. Be patient. There's a black foam adhesive layer that should stay stuck to the digitizer layer, but if it sticks to the screen, it peels off easily enough. You'll likely be left with a little bit of sticky residue on the metal frame of the screen. gently drag in with a clean microfiber cloth like a glasses cleaning cloth and you'll remove the bulk of it. Keep the pressure light though and be careful not to touch the screen itself. Remember, these faceplates are transparent, so it is worth cleaning up the frame properly. When you're done, it will look like a brand new part and it will fit snugly into the faceplate. What you should notice is that the opening for the speaker is on top of the screen's ribbon cable, so what we need is enough room for the ribbon to fit in. What I found was that the speaker's got a little bit of a plastic tab at each end and that actually prevents it from fitting neatly, so I used a pair of side cutters to just trim the tab off each side. This avoids the speaker pushing against the edge of the screen or the ribbon cable bracket. On the back of the speaker are 2 solder points. They're quite long, so it's worth trimming them down to a smaller size. I put flux on each point and then added a bit of solder. I took a look at the motherboard and did a rough check to see how long the wires needed to be. I used some Keynote wire, which is really thin, but it did do the job well on the previous build that I did. I measured towards the speaker area from the audio ground next to where pin 44 of the top screen bracket is, as well as the SPLO point, and I cut the wires a little bit longer than I actually needed. At this point, I used alcohol and a cotton bud to clean up any flux residue, as well as cleaning up the button contact points while they were all exposed. I prepared the wires by stripping the end, leaving a tiny bit of wire exposed. I put a bit of flux on the end and then heated the end of the wire and tinned it with a little bit of solder. Then I held it in place near SPLO in a vertical orientation to run alongside the screen. I melted the solder point and let it merge with the solder on the end of the wire. If you let it cool, it should be secure enough. Repeat the process with the other wire at the audio ground point. Now it is a small point, but the join will hold if you take your time and you're careful. Next, route the wire towards the speaker area, making sure it won't get in the way of the buttons. Avoid that whole white area and be careful not to go too close to the screen, because the screen or the shell will end up pinching it. Put your screen in place, slotting the ribbon into the bracket and securing it with the clip. Your speaker will be going on top of the ribbon, so if your wires are too long at this point, you can carefully trim them, being very careful not to put any strain on any of your existing solder work. It doesn't matter which wire you attach to which point on the speaker, just tin the end of the wire, hold it in position in the speaker, reheat the end of the wire and the speaker contact, and the solder should merge into one blob, securing the wire in place. I cut the speaker contacts a little bit shorter to try and keep things looking neat. I used a tiny bit of double-sided tape just to hold the speaker in place on the ribbon before reassembling. Just to help it stay in place while you're trying to align everything with the faceplate. It worked really well. With the speaker in position next to the screen, you can use the spudger to help route the wires. They will be visible, so in this case I resisted the temptation to use tape just in order to keep everything looking neat. Move the wire away from the screen by just a couple of millimeters. There is a plastic frame around the edge of the screen on the faceplate and it will pinch the wires if you're not careful. Now you're almost ready for reassembly. Just turn your attention to the plastic parts you'll be adding, such as the rear shell, battery cover, buttons, and so on. I find a combination of a toothbrush and some baby wipes can work wonders on all the hard to reach areas. For the gap around the edge where the faceplate will be seated, the pointed end of the spudger is great for getting any dirt out of that little gap for a much neater fit later. For the reassembly, I found the top half of the DS with a soft cloth over it gives us a good surface to support the faceplate, which is laid top down with the button areas overhanging, so the D-pad and the face buttons can all be dropped in position all the way without your work surface pushing them back in. Put the silicone pads in place. This will help keep the buttons in position for the next step. Your motherboard is assembled with the screen and the speaker and will need flipping over. However, without the digitizer, the screen isn't secured on the right hand side, and if you flip the motherboard over, it'll end up hanging off and potentially cause damage to the ribbon. What I find works well is to lift the faceplate with one hand and poke a finger through the screen opening, and you can then use the other hand to bring the motherboard near, reach in with that finger and place it in the center of the screen to hold it steady, then flip over the motherboard and carefully guide all the parts together. Now some of the parts may be a tight fit, so you might need to do a little bit of wiggling and pushing near any screw posts to get anything in position. You can always polish up the surface of the screen later to remove your fingerprints, so don't worry about that. When everything feels pretty much flat, look at the front and make sure the speaker and screen are correctly aligned and none of the wires are pinched. Now in this case it did look like one wire was being pinched, so I opened up a slight gap and reached inside with the spudger to tidy it up a bit. I ended up dislodging the D-pad when I did this, but it was easy enough to get it back in position. Do be careful that everything is aligned before you put the whole thing back together. Now once it's in place and you've checked the speaker, the wiring, the screen and the buttons, you can secure the motherboard in place with those two short silver Phillips screws. Now this is a fresh hole, so go slowly, take your time while you cut a new thread, move it to and fro with a clockwise and anti-clockwise motion, and don't be tempted to over tighten it. With the screws in place, check the travel of all the buttons. If they feel a little bit loose, just check the motherboard is firmly down in place, and if any screw posts seem a little bit stiff, just push the motherboard down a little bit past them. In this case, I noticed the clip on the top screen ribbon bracket was actually flipped up, which was making the faceplate slightly raised. I had to open up a little bit and reach in with the spudger to flip it back down. Now after that, everything fitted together much more neatly. One strange thing I noticed is that the alignment of the face buttons is just a tiny bit off. The way the button tabs sit in the recesses causes the text on the buttons to have a slight tilt. Not a deal breaker, but I am fussy and it did bother me just a tiny bit. So this is where the magnets come in. Take a look at this. When the shoulder button is in place and you put the hinge pin in the faceplate, the pin ends up flush with the edge of the button. There's not enough of it protruding to go into the rear shell. The button will work, but it just won't feel as responsive as it should. So what I did was I added a tiny 1mm thick 2mm diameter magnet to the end of the pin before putting it into the hole, and it ended up with the pin sticking out just that further 1mm from the button, which gave it just enough extra to secure it in the rear shell and get the buttons working much better. You don't necessarily need magnets, just something to block the hole a little bit. I just happened to have these magnets handy and they were absolutely perfect for my needs. To put the shoulder buttons in, put the spring in the gap on the button, feed the pin through the hole in the button and the spring, put it into the faceplate hole, and then use tweezers to pull the spring around and get it into the slot. They should hold securely fairly easily. If they don't, you've probably just got the springs on the wrong side. There is a right way around to those springs. With the shoulder buttons installed, put the Wi-Fi board back on and prepare the back panel by putting the power switch and the volume slider in place. They mostly slide in position and then need clicking into place. Carefully put the rear shell in place and make sure the volume slider and power switch are correctly aligned. Then work your way around the edge of the shell and faceplate, clipping them securely together. Once everything is in place, you can screw the console together. Start with the short silver Phillips screw in the battery compartment and then the 3 tri-wing screws at the other corners. Remember, these are fresh screw posts, so you'll need to take the time to cut a thread just like you did in the one before. Put the small tri-wing screw into slot 1 and finish off with the 2 gold coloured Phillips screws where the rubber feet will go. Put the battery and its cover in position, securing it with the Phillips screw. Finally, put the 2 rubber feet in place. They're usually still sticky enough to go right down without the need for any additional glue. Flip it over and all should be well. You'll need to carefully clean up the LCD from where you planted your finger right in the middle of it, but otherwise you should be good to go and ready to test out your new unit. Test the feel of all the buttons as well as the shoulder buttons and the volume slider. Try out the power switch, and if all goes well, your console should boot up. You may well need to go through the setup process as you remove the battery before. What I normally do is enter the date and time, but when it comes to the birthday, I quite like to put the current date in, so you're marking the macro's birthday, which is quite fun. When you put a cartridge in, what will happen is that it will boot to the DS menu screen, but then you go into the settings at the bottom, go on Game Boy Advanced settings and make sure your games will play on the lower screen. After that, you can set it to auto mode, which means it'll boot straight to the cartridge. After doing all that, it will shut down. Try switching it on and it should boot your game, and hopefully you'll hear sound through your speaker too. A quick check of the buttons with my test cart and they all worked. Although between you and me, the L button didn't actually work consistently and I ended up replacing it, but I will not bore you with the details of that in this video. It gave me a chance to align the speaker a little bit better when I had it open, so it wasn't all bad. Now I have an Easy Flash Omega cartridge which comes with an alternate low profile shell designed to fit in the DS Lite without sticking out, which makes it absolutely perfect for these macro builds. A quick check with a few games sees the speaker working surprisingly well for something so tiny, and the screen looking absolutely fantastic. A really great end result and a project well worth trying out. As I mentioned earlier in this video, you can buy these kits from ZedLabz. Make sure you use my link in the description along with the code JoeBleeps to save yourself some money and support my channel. I've done a lot of macro builds over the years, and while I wouldn't necessarily class this one as easy, it does give us a relatively straightforward way to revive a broken DS Lite in the form of a slick, modern and very professional looking Game Boy Advance console. I love that the kit comes with the speaker and the resistor, so effectively it's just a one-stop solution. While I wasn't keen on losing the touchscreen at first, seeing the clarity of the graphics and the vibrant colors and the pristine display when it's running games, I think it works really well and it more than justifies the sacrifice. I've been waiting to make this video for quite a while now. I bought a few faceplates from ZedLabz last time they had some in stock, but they've been sold out for quite a while. They recently got a new delivery, so hopefully if you're watching this and you want to get one, they should have some still in stock. If you try this project out, or if you want some tips, or if you want to ask about Game Boy macro mods in general, let me know in the comments. I love chatting with you all in there, and I do try and reply to any comments I get as soon as possible. As always, like, subscribe and sign up for notifications if you haven't already. I appreciate all of your support with helping me build up this little channel. If you want to keep watching, there's some more content to keep you busy here. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video. Bye.